Hi, I'm Phil Ware, and I want to welcome you to Verse of the Day's focus called ToGather. ToGather looks a little more deeply at our Sunday's Verse of the Day. It's also part of a worship guide that has songs, a communion reflection, and a closing blessing along with this message. And you can find a link to that in Verse of the Day just below this video. I'm glad you're here. We're talking about a really important subject. I don't know about you, but many times when someone is facing a very difficult, trying time, someone with good intentions will go to them and say, well, just remember, God does not ever give us anything more than we can handle. And while that sounds good at first blush, when you're the person that's struggling, you kind of go, well, then I wish I was a lot weaker so I didn't have to face anything this hard. Because if this is what comes to me when I can handle it, I don't want it. And then you look a little more deeply and you go, wow, there's not a whole lot of empathy in that statement. That's a statement people who don't know what to say without thinking and without realizing how hurtful it is to the person that hears it. It's not helpful to know that God's not going to send us anything we can't handle. And then I get to thinking even more deeply, and my response back is, where does it say that in the Bible? Where does it say God won't give us anything more than we can handle? And you start digging, and the Bible doesn't say that. It doesn't say that anywhere. You won't find it. In fact, life and Satan are guaranteed to give us more than we can handle. Life has built into it times of grief, sorrow, and then on top of that, you have pandemics like we're going through now, and you have difficult times economically, or you have people that abandon you or cheat you or rob you and leave you in bad places and positions, and none of that you asked for or deserved, and they hit you all at once and you can't handle them. Life guarantees that. And Satan's job, John 8 says, Jesus says in John 8, Satan's been a liar and a murderer from the beginning. His job is to deceive us and to crush us. Go look at Mark 5 if you want to know what Satan wants to do with us. And there's a man who couldn't handle what Satan had thrown into his life. So life and Satan ensure that statement, God won't give us anything more than we can handle, is an absolute falsehood. But there's an even more theological reason to never say those words. And that's because Jesus did. Jesus did give his disciples more than they can handle. On a number of occasions, Jesus put them in situations where they were totally in over their heads. They didn't have the strength, the ability, the power to negotiate what stood in front of them. And so when we understand this, we appreciate a story that's centered in our verse of the day. Here's our verse of the day. It's from Luke 9, verse 12. Jesus replied to his disciples, "You give them something to eat." They answered, "We only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, unless we go buy food for all this crowd." The context of our verse of the day is the feeding of the 5,000. So I want you to hear this statement in the context of all the verses that surround it. This comes from Luke chapter 9. We'll begin with verse 12. Late in the afternoon, the 12 disciples came to Jesus and said, "Send the crowds away to the nearby villages and farms so that they can find food and lodging for the night. There is nothing to eat here in this remote place." He replied, "You give them something to eat." And they answered, "We have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, unless we go buy food for all this crowd." For there were about 5,000 men there. Jesus replied, "Tell them to sit down in groups of about 50 each." So all the people sat down. Jesus took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looked up toward heaven, and he blessed them. Then, breaking the loaves into pieces, he kept giving the bread and fish to his disciples so that they could distribute it to the people. Now that's the scriptural context, but this is one of those few miracles, one of these few episodes in the life of Jesus that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell. And when we put the pieces together, this is what we know about the circumstances. Jesus' disciples were weary, and he was trying to get away so that they could rest. They had just accomplished a lot of great things, but were worn out. Jesus himself was weary and saddened because of John the Baptizer, his cousin's death. He knew John's demise meant he was now on center stage and his demise was next. Third, the crowd was weary. They had followed Jesus for several days and they were in a remote place, and it was a difficult place, and there was no place for water and food and lodging. And they were away from any resources. And then there were 5,000 men, not counting women and children. It was a huge mob. In one of the accounts, we find out that Philip says 200 denarii. That's 2/3 of a year's wage for a middle-class person, would only provide enough money to give everyone one little bite of bread. It was financially impossible. And in the middle of that, Jesus looks at them and says, "Okay, boys, you feed them." He put them in over their head. He gave them a situation that in their own power, even together, they couldn't handle. You see, there was no way that Jesus' 12 loose lug nuts could handle this situation. Now, some of you may be unfamiliar with my term for the apostles, loose lug nuts. And the best way I can describe it is these guys were dangerous and made a lot of noise and didn't really get it until Jesus had been raised from the dead. And the image of loose lug nuts comes from times past when cars had a hubcap, and if a lug nut or two got loose, the wheel would wobble. And if one of them came off, it went into the hubcap and it made lots of noise. In other words, they were noisy and dangerous. And at this stage, that's pretty much what the disciples were. They were noisy and dangerous. And there was no way that they were going to feed this crowd. What's more, they didn't even have the imagination to come up with an unrealistic solution. Now, those of you that are parents have had a child or two go through that stage somewhere between 5 years old and 10 years old, where you come by and they're drawing something and you ask them what that is, and they say, "It's an invention to feed the whole world," or "It's an invention to help us go to space more easily." And they have all these unrealistic ideas, and they're going to invent something to help us do it. As a parent, you don't want to stifle that imagination. But in your heart of hearts, you know, there's no way that's realistic. But you encourage them. And what Jesus is challenging the disciples to do is to think beyond the edges of their imagination. He's even looking for unrealistic solutions, and they can't even imagine one. They are in over their head. They're in a place they can't handle. They were going to have to reach out to him for help. But instead, they just sat there, dumbfounded, not knowing what to do. As humans, we have a tendency to depend upon our own strength, our own ability to solve problems, our own ability to fix the messes that surround us, until we reach that point where we can't handle it anymore. It's then that we ask for help. We reach out to Jesus. We depend upon him in ways that we haven't to that point. And that's exactly what Jesus wanted the apostles to do, to realize that in their own power they couldn't handle it, but they needed to bring it to him. The apostle Paul wrote about this situation in his own experience. Paul is very honest about his struggle to overcome something, and God doesn't allow it to happen. He forces Paul to depend upon Jesus to help him with his ministry. In 2 Corinthians 12, verses 7 through 10, Paul writes, "Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.' Therefore," Paul says, "I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." God didn't take away Paul's thorn in the flesh. He didn't want Paul to think he was the power behind the great things that God was accomplishing through him. And so Paul had to learn to depend upon God in his weaknesses. And he went through all sorts of them in addition to the thorn on the flesh: beatings, floggings, jail. He was stoned and left for dead. He lived a tough life and then was martyred at the end of it. But none of that meant that God abandoned him. No, God's power was made perfect in all of those things that he went through. And Paul learned that he couldn't handle it. He had to lean in and lean on Jesus. So let's go back to our story. And how does the crowd get fed? It's one of those unrealistic kids that comes and says, "I've got a picnic basket, and it's got 5 loaves and 2 small fish. Can that help?" And Andrew, as he often does, takes the boy to Jesus. Now, Philip goes, "What's that in the face of so many?" And Jesus brushes it aside because he wants the apostles to realize when things are too big for them to handle or even imagine a solution, he's got it. If they'll just let go of what they can't handle and place it in the hands of the one who can. So, what does Jesus do? He takes the bread and he breaks it, he tears it, and he gives some to the disciples. And then he does it again, and he does it again, and he does it again. He blessed that bread, and it multiplied. I don't know how exactly. I don't even think they knew how. But they just kept passing out bread and fish to a crowd that was seated in groups of 50 and 100. I kind of have an idea that Thomas, who was always the careful accountant type, was the one that counted up how many groups of 50 and 100 there were, so that we knew that there were at least 5,000. And the result was really beautiful. They all ate as much as they wanted, and afterwards the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. You think it was an accident that there were 12 baskets of leftovers? Do you think each lug nut holding a basket of leftovers was just a coincidence? No, the Lord Jesus was trying to help these guys understand that when they're in situations they can't handle, they've got to hand over the problem. You see, Jesus deliberately put the apostles in a situation where they were over their heads and had more than they could handle, so that they would know that he could do what they couldn't even know to ask or begin to imagine. And you know what? I'm pretty confident that each of us is going to go through several times in our lives where we have more than we can handle. I kind of feel like that right now myself. And even though this lesson was planned long ago, I kind of feel like it's for me today. Jesus can do more with his power than we can even imagine. All those wild-eyed inventions of our young children as they think of what they're going to do to fix the future, Jesus can do even more than that. We've just got to place what we can't handle into his hands. Just because Jesus can do more than we can ask or imagine doesn't mean he's necessarily going to do it in this situation. Yeah, that's the truth. And we know it's the truth because that's what happened with Paul, right? That's what happened to each of the 12 apostles who were martyred, right? That's what happened with Jesus when he prayed for the cup of suffering to be removed from him. But not what I will, but your will be done, Father. And Jesus went ahead and went through the cross. And he placed his spirit into the hands of the one who could handle taking Jesus through death and emerging with resurrected life on the other side. Until we're stretched beyond what we can handle, we don't really have to rely on God, do we? We just lean on our own strength. But when we're in over our head, when we can't handle it, we have to rely on God. So even in the easy things, we need to lean in and lean on Jesus for guidance, support, and strength. Because sooner or later, we're going to face a time where we don't have that strength. Jesus wants us to realize God's grace is sufficient for what we need. What we need is God's grace. We need his presence. We need his assurance. We need his promise that he'll never leave us or forsake us, like Hebrews 13:5-6 says, that nothing in life or death or anything in all creation can separate us from his love for us in Christ Jesus, that Paul says at the end of Romans 8. You see, as we lean in and lean on Jesus, we learn that God's grace is sufficient, even though there will be times that our situation is not handled the way we would like. Now, I mentioned that I felt like this message may be as much for me as it is for you. Let me explain why. Our family's in the middle of a lot of tumult and change, and over the last couple of weeks, my stepfather of 37 years, a precious man I love, had a stroke. And it reminded me that one day we are all going to walk through the long valley of shadows, the valley of the shadow of death, as Psalm 23 talks about it. And we're going to be facing what is too much for any of us to handle. In Cornbread English, I've said it this way to kind of lighten the moment, but emphasize the reality. One of these days, people are going to dress us up to look nice and lay us down and put us at the front of the church building and say a bunch of nice things over us, and then take us out to the cemetery, put us in a hole, and throw some dirt in our face, and go back to the church building and eat chicken. I don't say that lightly, but I do say it with a touch of humor, because Jesus' resurrection from the dead made that stark reality the gateway to new life and fresh hope. You see, my stepfather, Grady Jolly, a great man, a faithful Christian, a hero in World War II, a man that's led many people to Jesus and loved all sorts of people. Well, we laid him to rest this past Friday. We did the things that I just talked about. And as he faced death, my mom, who was with him constantly, emphasized that not once did he show fear, agitation, concern, worry. He knew how to lean in and lean on Jesus and put into Jesus' hands what he couldn't handle. Life's going to throw you some things you can't handle. And that's why Jesus has gone before us. And we can lean in and lean on and hand him what we can't handle and trust that our Father's grace is sufficient to get us through and get us home. Until next week, God bless.